Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our discussion on the new Center for Election Innovation and Research report, the expansion of voting before Election Day 2000 to 2024. The Center for Election Innovation and Research, or CEIR, is a nonpartisan nonprofit that works with election officials at the state and local level from around the country and from both sides of the aisle. We seek to build voter trust and confidence, increase voter participation, and improve the efficacy of election administration. Today's webinar will be recorded, and we will share the recording with all registrants in the coming days. It will also be posted on the CEIR YouTube channel. Today, you will hear from David Becker, who's the Executive Director and founder of CEIR, as well as the co-author of The Big Truth, Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie. He has more than 25 years of experience in elections, serving as a senior attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice voting section in both the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations, as well as leading the elections team at the Pew Charitable Trusts prior to founding CEIR. Miles Parks is a correspondent on NPR's Washington desk, where he covers voting and election security. The research we're covering today was inspired by Miles's request for historical data around voting access, and NPR was the first news organization to report the findings. Lastly, we have Chris Mann, who is the new research director at CEIR, leading a growing portfolio of research initiatives, including matters pertaining to voter registration, voter access, election integrity and security, and election policy. Chris has been involved in research on election administration and election policy in a variety of capacities for 3 decades. I also want to quickly cover some housekeeping items. To ask a question, you can do that in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical questions, you can raise your hand and we will connect with you over the chat. Thanks again for joining, and now I'll hand it over to David.
Thanks, Liz, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this Friday. I'm going to hand it off to Chris Mann to talk about some of the details about the report. But I wanted to talk about a couple of things real quick. First, to give you a little more of details about how this report came about. Over the past several years, CEIR has put out a piece of kind of a one-pager that showed what states allowed early voting or no excuse mail voting at the time. And it was a snapshot of what the states looked like in several elections in 2020 and in 2022. And Miles, all credit to him, Miles reached out to me several months ago and asked if we or anyone had ever looked at that historically, going back maybe to as long ago as 2000. And it was a really good question. And it turned out no one had. So we decided to put our research team to work under the leadership of Chris Mann, who is new to us, but not at all new to the world of election administration and particularly issues related to early and mail voting. And we went back and confirmed exactly what the reach of early and no excuse mail voting options were across the United States, going as far back as the 2000 election. And as you'll see, it's been quite the expansion of those opportunities for voters since then. So let's go to this kind of top line findings in this. First, if you look at the expansion of voting before election today, it is really nonpartisan. You can't really see any correlation between red states or blue states doing this more than others. It's been passed by Republican state legislatures. It's been passed by Democratic state legislatures. It's being used by voters of both parties. It's popular amongst voters across the political spectrum. I think that's one of the reasons we don't see any states really retreating from offering these options. Generally, states have just moved consistently in a trend of offering these options more and more, and that's because voters across the political spectrum really appreciate it. This is true even if you look in 2000 all the way to today, if you look at trends, you see that both Republicans and Democrats have done this. In the 2000s, it was often Republican-led states that were pushing early voting options, and especially mail voting options. States like Arizona and Montana were at the lead of this. And often it was also states in the West that were pushing some of these issues, but it really wasn't a partisan issue. And that's led to its wide use across the political spectrum, again, as I mentioned, Republicans and Democrats. Next number, Walker, please. If you look at the share of ballots that were cast either by mail or early in person, that percentage has been going pretty steadily up. In 2022, it was 50% of all voters cast a ballot before Election Day in the November midterm elections. And in 2020, that number was higher. And of course, we have to be cognizant of the fact that that was during COVID, when people were worried about getting sick. And we saw about 69% of ballots cast before Election Day in 2020. That level is probably not going to be maintained, but we do see that we've seen growth in that in general. And as I said, up to 50% in 2022. And I think it's very likely we'll see a percentage of that around in 2024. Lastly, I think this is a really important point that needs to be made about early and mail voting. We often talk about it just from the perspective of whether this makes it more convenient for voters to participate and how much they like it. But it's also really good for election administrators because it enhances election security significantly. When we're concentrating all of our voting into a 12 or 15-hour period of time on a single day, that becomes a single point of failure. And if you have any kind of malicious events, a cyber attack, or some kind of disinformation event, the ability to recover from that is going to be very limited because all of the voting has to occur in a single time. It could also be something innocuous. It could be weather. It could be traffic. It could be a power outage. All of those things could happen and could affect voting. And when you concentrate all of the voting, 160 million ballots were cast in 2020. If you put all of that into a 12 to 15-hour period, a lot of things can happen and you'd make it very difficult to recover. Whereas if you spread it out over days or even weeks, and you put some voting in person and some by mail, if there's a problem, if there's a technical glitch, if there's a malfunction, if there's some kind of malicious event, the ability to recover is greatly, greatly enhanced. Specifically, you can imagine if there was disinformation about where to vote or how to vote, but it occurred on the first day of early voting, worst case scenario, those people can come back the next day or a day or two later. If there's a particular polling place that has a power outage during early voting, there's probably several other early voting sites all over the county that people can go to, or they could come back another day. But if that happens on Election Day, it's very, very difficult to recover. And so that's why it's not a surprise we've seen states really adopt this and embrace early voting and mail voting on a very nonpartisan and bipartisan basis. So now I'm going to hand it over to Chris, who's going to walk us through some of the more detailed findings in the report. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, David. So on this first slide, Walker, can you pop it up? So these two maps on the right, you see what we will have according to current law in 2024, and that's 46 states and DC will offer eligible voters options to vote before Election Day. And on the left, that map is from 2000, which is the earliest presidential election that we looked at in this report. So we've doubled from the 24 states that offered options to vote before Election Day back in 2000. On these maps, which you'll see on a couple of these slides here, the green states offer unrestricted options for both early in-person and voting by mail. The yellow states offer unrestricted early in-person voting, but require a reason to cast a mail ballot. And the orange states require Election Day voting unless the voter has a reason. As David said earlier, especially when you look at that 2024 map, you will see that this is east and west, south and north, red states, blue states, and purple states. And David talked about mail ballots being something that was prominent in the West. If you look back at that 2020 map on the left, you can see, sorry, that 2000 map on the left, you can see Texas was a leader in early voting. So was Tennessee, kind of the Southeast, led the charge on early voting in the way that the West led the charge on mail ballots. So if we go to the next slide, this is an animation that you can find on our website. It moves through each presidential election and really illuminates the movement of states changing from orange to yellow and green over time. Right, options have been to vote before election day, been part of elections for a long time with the 24 states that we had back in 2000. But a lot of the change in the expansion we saw really came from that 2000 election. So we had 11 states in the first 8 years to get us to 35, and then another 11 in the next 16 years. So a lot of this change, right? 6 states between 2000 and 2004, 5 more states from 2004 to 2008. Of course, we had the big spike in 2020 related to the pandemic, where we had 11 states change categories. Some of those switch back, but we see some of those changes then being put in place permanently for 2024, as well as some states going into 2020. 4 states that had changed before the pandemic came along and changed categories. We can also illuminate this trend on the next slide, where you see a bar graph. This is the same data that you see on the maps. The vertical axis is the percentage of states that offer options. And you can see the black line there is the trend line over time. So from 24 states up to 46 states, you can see that 2024 is right on that trend line. And again, you can see the bump up from the temporary things that happened in response to COVID. But the long-term trend is pretty steady, and we're now down to just 4 states that don't offer eligible citizens a option to vote before election day. If we go to the next slide, this is the same maps that you've seen, but we cut the data a little bit differently and looked at the share of the voting age population that have an option to vote before election day. And 97% of voting age citizens in the US, according to current law, will have an option to vote before election day without needing to have a reason. So that's up from 40% back in 2000, so well more than doubling. So it really is widespread to have people have an option to vote before election day. Happy to answer more questions. Miles is now going to grill us, and I suspect, as he always does, he's going to have questions to dig into the data a little bit more. So I'll turn it over to Miles to put us on the hot seat, and then we'll take questions from you. You can put those in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen.
Yeah, and I would just second that. You guys feel free to ask questions. We're going to leave some time at the end for a bunch of questions from anyone attending. Yeah, I was so excited about this report. I feel like selfishly, the most fun part about being a journalist is being able to think of a question. And I called David a couple months ago, and it was just something I'd been noodling on, honestly, since 2022, because I relied heavily on the CEIR report from 2022 in my reporting leading up to that midterm election, and just trying to level set on explaining voting is such a hard beat because there are 10,000 local jurisdictions, 50 states plus DC, and trying to talk about things at a national level, zooming out, is really, really difficult. And so selfishly, I was really excited to just call David one day, ask this question, and then a couple months later, a bunch of really smart people had put this together. And I think it's going to be really important for me and for anyone who's covering this election when we're talking about how people are able to cast ballots in 2024. And I think that's kind of where I want to start. Is one of the things when I read this report, and as I've mentioned to my colleagues and my friends, this 97% of American voters live in a place where they can vote early. I get shocked reactions to that. People are very surprised at that number. And David, why is that? Why are people so surprised at the accessibility options that are available?
I mean, it's interesting because the 97% is really, if anything, it might even be a little bit of an undercount, because in those 4 states, Alabama, Mississippi, New Hampshire, and Delaware, that require an excuse to vote by mail, there are some people who fit those excuses that we didn't count in with that, right? So there's the vast majority of people have an option, and that option might differ a little bit. Some states offer 28 days of early voting, some offer a handful of days of early voting, but voters tend to adapt to those, whatever they are.
I think we live in an era right now where everything is viewed through a political lens, and we hear a lot of messages that constantly get sent to us that voting is hard, that there's widespread voter suppression, and certainly there are attempts to suppress votes. I think they largely fail, but there are certainly legislators that try to do that. And also, we're hearing messages about vote rigging and fraud all the time, that your vote doesn't matter. And in my career, I've really tried to define those things, and then where they were overestimated, push back on them. Because we have to remember also, we live in a country where we only see half of the eligible voter population or more vote once every 4 years. The default for most eligible voters is not to show up to vote. We're only going to see more than half of them vote in a presidential election. And that means they're not regular voters. They're not used to doing this. They don't know all of the options necessarily. And it's important, I think, to tell those voters that if you choose to participate, it's going to be really easy. The vast majority of you are going to have a really positive, convenient experience if you try to vote. That doesn't mean they're automatically going to turn out to vote, but it's really important to push back on the narratives that voting is hard. And I should also say, I think part of it is, is our election system perfect? It isn't. Does it reach all of the people who it should? Are there some people who experience barriers? They absolutely do. And we should always be working to minimize that to the degree possible. But we're doing better than we've ever done before, and that's really key. If we look back at 2000 compared to where we are now, just in those 24 years, we've done a remarkable job in spreading out access and giving voters choices.
Can you talk a little bit more, Chris? Do you want to jump in there on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in with one quick point on that, which is we know from lots of research about the way people think about their election system that they tend to think that they know their local election system from experience. They don't pay a whole lot of attention to how elections work elsewhere. So we know that they know and understand their own election system, and they're generally very confident in it. They're local, very confident in their local election, very confident, little less confident, but generally confident in their state. But it drops off a lot for the national. And one of the likely explanations for that is that people sort of make assumptions that mine is good, but that because there's all this controversy, there must be problems elsewhere. And I think baked into that is an assumption, well, I know voting's easy for me. I have lots of options. But if there's all this talk and all these complaints, then it must not be good, and people must not have these kinds of choices elsewhere. And so having this national conversation, that's one of the reasons we wanted to do this report and really focus on the national level as opposed to sort of state by state and look at that macro big picture, is to have that national conversation, and is to share that information of, hey, look at this map. It's 2024 is green and a bit of yellow, and very little of the states that don't offer people options anymore. So I think that's it is not surprising in that respect that we run into this. We know this about the way people understand elections.
Well, how should we square this data with the narratives from the last few years? So much focus has been on the states with Republican legislatures that have worked to use the lie that elections are fraudulent inherently, that there is that the 2020 election specifically was tainted by fraud, which obviously has never been bore out through the many lawsuits and investigations and audits that have been conducted. But how should people square the efforts to restrict voting rights with this data? Is this a contradiction of those narratives, or is this additive? How it is just a very confusing thing to take in both those pieces of information.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point, and there's people form very strong opinions about this based often through partisan lenses through which they're viewing things. But I definitely view this as additive. There is no question here that there are legislators who have tried to pass bills, not just in the last few years, but it's been something America has had to deal with for quite some time, that seeks to make it harder for some to vote. Sometimes it's racially influenced. Certainly we see it influenced from a political perspective, where there are legislators who think by passing certain laws and restricting some voters they think are less likely to vote for their party or their candidates, that they enhance their chances to win. There's two big problems with that. One is it just doesn't work. In general, the American voter is a very complex being.
even though we're promoting how easy it is to vote compared to historically right now, and I think factually that's accurate, ease of voting alone doesn't mean turnout's going to go up. Certainly in big presidential elections and federal general elections. In 2020, even with all the enhanced measures to allow people to vote, it still was probably difficult for people to make that decision because 1,000 people were dying a day. We had no vaccines. They were worried for their own health, the health of their families. People who worked in elections were getting sick. And so despite all of those difficulties, we still saw the highest turnout in American history. And I think that that's important to recognize here, that these efforts to suppress the vote almost never work. The second reason I think it's not a good idea is I just don't think it's ethical to tinker with the elections process in order to achieve a partisan goal. There are Republican states that have seen the highest turnout in their history and seen larger Republican victories than they've ever seen. Florida is a great example, Miles, which you're well familiar with. But in 2020, Florida saw its highest turnout in state history, and they saw the largest Republican margins in state history. Those two things live together, and so efforts to reduce the number of drop boxes or to require, as they've done in Florida, people to ask for a mail ballot more often than they had in the past in order to be on the mail voting list. Those are probably going to be somewhat unsuccessful in terms of reducing turnout. It might upset the voters, and probably not entirely the way we should be considering election policy.
Chris, I'm hoping you can walk through one of the things that the report illustrated to me is we're going to talk a little bit about partisanship in a second, but the geography of it, which you showed in the slides a second ago, but I want to dig into that a little bit more. Can you talk about the regions of the country and their different journeys to getting to where we are in 2024?
Yeah, I mean, first, I want to start by saying I'm going to grossly oversimplify this. So I'm probably going to leave out some state and be reprimanded for that. But in general, we can think about mail ballots coming from, originating on the West Coast. I mean, first of all, they started in the Civil War, when we gave soldiers the ability to vote from the battlefield, and they've been around with the excuse required, for 150 plus years now. But the idea of no excuse absentee balloting came from the West Coast and spread. But it, and we saw it adopted, but, it also makes jumps across the country. We see it in North Carolina and Florida. We're very early adopters, particularly after the 2000 election, when, the public and policymakers realized that our election system was under a lot of pressure. And giving people options was a way to take some of that pressure off, as David talked about, right? Some of the risks that we have when we're all on election day, right? And so you can generally see, and if you look at the animation that we showed earlier, right, you sort of see a left coast to or west coast to east coast movement there. And then with early voting, it has a very different pattern. I mentioned this, I think, briefly. Texas and Tennessee were among the states to do this early. There were a number of Western states that offered you this also, along with mail ballot options or instead of mail ballot options. And you see it also spread, but its spread is kind of really anchored in Texas and the Southeast. You see it move west into Arizona and New Mexico, and north through the Midwest, into places like Indiana and Illinois, Florida, North Carolina. It has been for a while the largest mode of voting, that people voted early in person. So it does have this kind of regional flavor, and that's pretty standard for a lot of legislative policy, that they disperse to neighbors in similar states, and that's people copycatting the things they see their neighbors do, or networks of state legislators and policy. So those are pretty typical patterns that we see in innovations. But yeah, it does have these two sort of nodes of west to east from mail ballots and southeast, sort of up and out for early in-person voting.
And Miles, if I could just jump in for a second too, often when we think about movement from west to east, there's often kind of the inference that this means this was something blue states developed first and then spread to red states. That's not what happened. If you look at California, which was, I think, one of the very first that adopted, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, no excuse mail voting in the 80s. People as old as I, who was a California voter in the 80s, will remember there were Republican governors of California in the 80s. I mean, California was very much of a battleground state. Ronald Reagan won California in 1984. So these are, and then when you see states like Arizona really spread kind of much more widespread mail voting to its electorate, that was largely driven by Republican legislatures in those states and Republican election officials, which is to credit them. I mean, a lot of the innovation, it didn't necessarily apply to only one party. It was a bipartisan piece of innovation that, I get the question sometimes, and Chris, you might have some thoughts on this too. Why is the West developing these things before the East? And I think my personal impression is a lot of the election laws that came and kind of the structure of elections that came about in the East have been around for twice as long as the ones in the West, because those states are newer, and the ability, and also kind of they have a tradition of citizen democracy, ballot initiatives, things like that I think lent themselves to bringing about this change easier. A good example of that, quite frankly, is a footnote we have in the report, which is that Delaware doesn't want to be in the orange category. Delaware wants to be in the green category. Their legislature passed bills to allow for early and no excuse mail voting that just a couple of weeks before we released the report were held to be unconstitutional under the Delaware state constitution, which, for those of us who've also lived at Delaware in some point of our lives, we get taught very early that was the very first state. So this goes back a very long time. So I think that's probably why we see the Western tradition, not because of partisanship, but because they are not bound to these 250-year-old sets of laws.
Yeah, I feel like Delaware also ties into the other geographic trend that I noticed. This report really showed me, honestly, I hadn't paid all that much attention, I think partially because there are fewer battleground states in the Northeast, but the Northeast, up until the 2020 election, there were a number of states that were in this either election day or very little access to early voting category. And it feels like the pandemic really did, or the rules around the pandemic really did kind of move a lot of those states, force them into this new category. Can you talk about the effect that COVID had on supercharging some of these trends that were already happening?
Yeah,
Chris,
so I'll jump in on that one. And just to add something to what David said that is sort of lost to history now. But if we go back to the early part of looking at both early in-person voting and mail ballots, one of the huge drivers of initiating a lot of these in the early states was dealing with the challenge of very large geographic, but very small population rural counties. So you have a few thousand voters, you're only going to have a few thousand election day precincts. But that meant that people, some of these counties are the size of Rhode Island, which people in the Northeast have a hard time wrapping their head around. So you're talking about people who have to drive 2 hours to get to the town where their polling place is. So this is true in California, where some of the earliest counties to mail everybody a ballot were very large geographically, but small population. That's true in, Midwestern states. It was true of why Texas adopted early voting. So that the day you go to town to do your grocery shopping in the 2 weeks before election day is the day you drive from your ranch. You don't have to make a separate trip on election day. To talk about the Northeast, yeah, I mean, I've been talking about this topic for longer than I want to admit, but a couple of decades. And I used to be a professor in the Northeast, and I always, said to my students who were from the Northeast, like, you all are the weird ones at this point. You're the people who are left out, right? Up to 2020. And I would make jokes about stereotypical Northeasterners that I'm not going to make here and get in trouble for them. Right, but there was a sort of a different sense, and it's the exact opposite of that historical pattern, right? High density, people don't have to travel very far, and I think that was part of why they were slow to adopt. Now there were exceptions. Maine has had mail ballots since very, very early on. New Jersey had permanent mail ballots was as early as Colorado, right? So that's going back 10, 15 years now. So there were exceptions, but they were generally latecomers to the game. And if you think about it, just from a sort of simple spread point of view, they're farthest from both that southeastern core around Texas for early in person and farthest from the west. So some of the story maybe their neighbors weren't doing it, and so it's sort of they were boxed in by those waves. But I think, the pandemic made them think, okay, we have to do something here. We have to solve the pandemic. And hey, look, all these other states are having a lot of success. They know how to do it. David and I both worked with various, former election officials or current election officials from these states in the South and East, talking to their colleagues in the Northeast and push them over that hurdle. But you can also look at that long-term trend line, right? They were like, we just saw they were states that waited to see and learn from other states how to do it and do it well.
Yeah, I'd just add, because I think that's a really good observation from you, Miles, and Chris's explanation is right on. There maybe were a handful of states that where the COVID experience pushed them along a little bit. New Jersey might come to mind. But if you look at, states like Pennsylvania, New York, and Virginia, all of which were orange in 2016 and are green in 2024. And all of them passed their reforms for no excuse mail voting and early voting prior to COVID. It is often, the presidential election in 2020 was the first time that voters in Pennsylvania had ever in any federal election gotten to vote no excuse by mail or early in person, even though that's one of our oldest states as well. But that passed in 2019 before the pandemic, and was passed again. I can't stress this enough. Both houses of the legislature were controlled by Republicans. I think almost all of the Republicans, if not all of them, voted for that bill. New York, the first federal election where they had options of early or mail voting were I believe in the 2018 midterm election. So 2020 was the first presidential. This again has nothing to do with partisanship. There might be a variety of reasons that it's been a little slower to adopt. COVID might have goosed some states along a little bit, but I think, if you look at the broader trends, COVID was it was more that their foresight to move towards mail voting and early voting, as New York and Pennsylvania did before they even knew about the pandemic, before it had even hit any place, ended up being beneficial and gave them more tools to handle the pandemic. They were farther along when it actually hit.
Okay, so then now that we're in this kind of new reality compared to 2020 in terms of most states having some way to vote early, can you dig in a little bit to what that will actually mean for turnout? What do we know about how this new early voting reality will translate? Does that mean that the higher turnout of the last few election cycles is here to stay? Is that correlated to the Trump effect, or is that correlated to the easier way it is, as your guys' data shows, to vote compared to what it was a decade or two ago?
Chris, you can take that first.
Okay. So the research is pretty clear that there's no partisan advantage. Let me start by saying that. And there's no real clear evidence that it increases turnout, especially in presidential elections. Some of these options in lower salience elections, your municipals, primaries, even to a smaller degree, midterm elections. But competitiveness is an enormous part of what's driving this. If we had a blowout presidential election, say a landslide like maybe 1996, turnout would go down even though voting has gotten much easier. And we've seen turnout go up and down in presidentials, even as the options to vote before election day have expanded, both nationally and within particular states, as either presidential or governor or Senate races, the kinds of high-profile races that drive things. So there isn't really that much connection, particularly in presidential years.
Yeah, I completely concur with that. I think if we plotted out turnout over the same 24 years, it would not be a steadily increasing line. It is all over the place. During the last 24 years, we've seen the highest turnout presidential election in history in terms of total number of ballots and in total percentage of voters who've cast a ballot, 67% in 2020, which is the most since universal suffrage. Um, uh, but we've also seen moderate to low turnout federal elections. 2012, 2016 were right kind of in the middle. 2008 was very high, however. So we see things all over the place. 2000 was actually kind of in the middle also. And in the midterm elections, we've seen a wide range of turnout variance during that time. Literally within a 4-year period in 2018, we saw the highest turnout midterm election in modern history since World War II in terms of percentage, about 50%, which is a very high watermark for midterm elections. And just 4 years earlier, we saw the lowest one in 100 years at 36% or so. So there's a lot of things. I think there is an effect that the former president has on turnout, clearly, both for him and against him. And so I think Chris would probably agree. We don't have enough data to really indicate like whether there's a greater long-term trend here that might exist, particularly in these high salience elections that Chris was talking about. But I also think it's really important that the availability of early voting and mail voting options is an important threshold to cross. It gives the campaigns and candidates an opportunity to drive voter turnout better, to contact their voters, to get them to turn out, and to maximize the use of their resources. What both parties will tell you, despite what one of the presidential candidates is saying on the trail, is that the parties and the campaigns, the professionals, they love mail voting and early voting. They push legislatures in this direction to some degree, because a voter you can get to turn out 10 days before the election is a voter you can forget about. You don't need to touch him again. You don't need to knock on his door. You don't need to send him a text. You don't need to call him. And that's incredibly important. It really doesn't matter whether you're a liberal Democrat or a conservative Republican. Everyone from a campaign perspective is trying to maximize their resources. And so early voting and no excuse mail voting are great ways to do that, in addition to all of the other benefits that we were already talking about.
I want to also tell everybody who's watching, please feel free to put some Q&As in the Q&A function. I'll get to those in just a minute or two. I do want to dig into the methodology just for a second, because I do think there is some aspect of there people who, if I was a person who I lived previously in California and North Carolina, and you were telling me that mail voting, like according to the map, if I was just looking at the colors, technically access to mail ballots is the same in those two states. In one of those states, North Carolina, you need multiple witnesses to be able to return your ballot. In California, prepaid postage, drop boxes, and you could give it to your friend who can go drop it off. There are a bunch of different rule changes that do affect actually how easy it is to vote that mail ballot. Same thing for early voting, where this report and your guys' previous reports have lumped in the states that offer a couple days in with the states that offer a few weeks of early voting. Obviously, that is a different kind of early voting for or voters experience that differently. Can you talk through your guys' decision making on lumping those kind of broad spectrums into the same categories?
Yeah, I'll start with that. I mean, I think you're quite right. I mean, we are not saying here that all of the green states are exactly equal. I think it's also, if you look at the rules in the states, and in some states they vary by counties as well, how many drop boxes are placed, how close they are to population centers, whether there's some places where counties have options to do fewer days or more days than other counties do, where they have longer hours or they can have more sites. If we got into that level of analysis, and it was discussed way back when we first did our first report, we wouldn't have 50 different categories. We might have 500 different categories, and they might not even be necessarily really all that helpful. For instance, there's pretty good evidence out there that no matter that even if you offer 28 days of early voting, that's not much better than maybe offering 9 or 10 days of early voting. That not much is done in terms of the early voting turnout that occurs in those very early days, maybe except for the first or second day. So it's very hard to put your thumb on the scale and decide, like, is it a drop box, having to go 5 miles to find a drop box as good as having to go 3 miles to find a drop box? And I think those kinds of things, we get into parsing and judgment calls that I don't think are relevant to most voters, because most voters seem to adapt to whatever is offered in their states pretty well. There are states, both blue states and red states, that require mail ballots to be in by election night, by the time the polls close. And some states allow them to be postmarked and come in a little bit later. And people in those states who have to get them in by election night are pretty attuned to getting those things in by election night, in most cases. So I think from the perspective of the voter, which is where most of our research comes from, and their ability to plan their voting experience out, we identified this as an important kind of binary choice. Do you have to vote on Tuesday, or do you get to think about voting some other time if that's more convenient for you? And that's why we portrayed it this way. This is not to say that if someone else wants to go out and say, here's the variation in counties in this state, and these counties are offering a little more early voting, that can be useful to voters in that state, perhaps. But I think for the big picture, I think this is the story we wanted to tell. Chris, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I will just add, we talked about this a lot. As we were looking at rules with the research team at the state rules, looking at the nuance, we collected all that. We have this great, very rich spreadsheet with all these details. But as David said, we'd end up with 50 different colors if we did that. And I guess the thing I would add to that is part of the reason it's really hard to draw a distinction is the combinations of these things. How do you categorize states that maybe they don't allow drop boxes at all, but they have, a really high number of early vote centers open for a really long time. If you put that above a place where it's really, they mail everybody a ballot and they have fewer places where you can vote early in person. It's really hard to do that, which is not to say those details are not important. But I will also add, a personal level, your hypothetical question, Miles, is a real one to me. I go through it every time my wife and I move, which we've done a fair number of times. And she's a native Californian, and every time, this is how I have to mail a ballot. That sucks, right? But then she just does it. Those are the rules. And I do think it reflects that people are adaptable very quickly. We're not pretending that the nuances are not important here. They are very important. And they're very important to the debates going on in those states about policy and administration. But again, as I said at the beginning, a big piece of our goal here was to inform that national conversation. And your first question about people's surprise, right, that there are these options, that is a part of the conversation that we're trying to address and trying to change so that people understand that national picture. And then we can dive back into those nuances. But if all we talk about is we're going to drop into one state where maybe there's some controversial legislation proposed, then people have a distorted picture of what goes on nationally.
Yeah,
really zooming out to that national level is the important piece.
Chris raised a really important point here, which is these state by state, even within state variations about voting culture, I think play into this to some degree. You can have both Georgia and Arizona make it pretty darn easy to vote by mail. They vary a little bit in how they offer that and how long it's been offered. But in Georgia, the percentage of people who tend to vote by mail is about 10%, whereas in Arizona, the percentage of people who vote by mail is over 80%. And that's largely a cultural difference that's been built up and has evolved over time. And whereas in Georgia, or perhaps in North Carolina, for instance, there's much more of a culture around going and voting in person early. Sometimes it's a community event. And so that, again, we didn't want to put our finger on the scale when voters already have a culture that they're used to and they're comfortable with, and they want to vote in that way. And so just the fact that, for instance, I don't know that with North Carolina's restrictions on mail voting, but availability of early voting, whether that creates a problem of a culture in North Carolina, whereas that would create a big problem in Arizona, given that the culture is at the point right now where so many return mail ballots, and that's their preferred way of voting. So I think just talking about the availability here is really important. If North Carolinians want to change their culture and make it easier to vote by mail, which I personally would think would be a good thing. They might see that culture change over time as voters become more familiar with it and comfortable with it.
We have a question in from Anna Spandorfer that kind of touches on this too, which is a really interesting question. She's basically asking, is there data that exists, or is there a way to overlay data on how people feel about how easy it is to vote or how accessible voting is in their state versus the options that are actually available? Like, is there data that shows that there is a disconnect or that there is a connection between people's understanding of all their options? Like, how do we know whether how people are actually interacting with the options available to them?
Can I speak broadly on that, Chris, and then hand it to you? Because one of the things we do see in polling about voters' feelings about their election process is their feelings get steadily better the smaller the jurisdictions get and closer to home. So people feel very confident about their counties or localities. They feel pretty darn confident about their states. They feel much less confident about other states. Of course, they're not experiencing that. And I think, and Chris will probably correct me if I'm wrong on this, I think that's pretty consistent across all the states, regardless of what their actual procedures are. And there are times when voters um, don't really fully understand how convenient it is to vote in their states, how many options there are available. I remember when I was back at Pew, we did polling on how easy it was to register to vote and asked people like, would it make it more likely for you to register to vote if you had online voter registration? And there were several places where we asked that, where we got high numbers there, but they already had online registration and they had for some time. So I think in general, and the other thing I wanted to say about this, I think this is a really good idea. And we might take that back and discuss it and think about it, because I don't know, the answer might be there's no correlation between kind of general feelings of confidence and comfort. And that might be good because it might be that they're already quite high. Chris, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so I can add a few points to that. One is that the awareness of what is available to people is highly correlated with how competitive their states are. So without drifting too much into other things that we look at the Center for Election Innovation and Research, election officials don't have a whole lot of resources to communicate with voters. And so the communication gets driven by what campaigns tell them. And so there are numerous cases where you can point to states that passed virtually identical laws at the same time, whether that's for early voting or mail ballots. And one state will rock it up, and the other will not see that take off. It'll take off much more slowly. It'll take off, but it'll go up by 5 points a year, as opposed to jumping up by 20 percentage points in terms of the percentage of voters that are using it. My favorite examples are New Jersey and Colorado passed almost identical mail ballot laws at the same time, right? Within 5, 6, 7 years, Colorado had shifted to mailing everybody a ballot because that's how everybody was voting. New Jersey didn't get around to trying that until 2020, and they were really prompted by the pandemic because New Jersey has a lot fewer competitive races at every level than Colorado does. And so that's a big part of it. But once people know, and there's actually been public opinion polling where people are asked, do you have confidence in early in-person voting or mail ballots? Or they preface the question with, hey, in Florida, you have both of these options. How confident are you? And when people are reminded that their friends and neighbors are voting in this way and they aren't hearing about problems, then they're much more confident. And it is that fact that people go back to the touchstone of their experience and the experience of their friends and neighbors. And if they don't hear about problems, then they have confidence in it. They trust it. They think it's a good idea, right? When they think of, their elderly parents who can't get to the polls, or their friends who work, on a schedule where they can't make it on election day. So early voting is great. So there's some of that dynamic. And I think one of the things that's really changed, because we started having a national conversation about this in a very different way than we ever had before in 2020, is that for a lot of people, they're a lot more aware. And so I think has been a shift, but I'm going to second David that it's definitely an interesting question and something that we're hoping to look at as to where people are in 2024 in terms of their attitudes and how it relates to their experience.
And as we're thinking about it, I want to throw this out, because this question definitely sparked some thoughts in my mind here. When we ask that question might be as important as how we ask the question. That asking that question before an election and asking it after an election might yield very different results, particularly based on the outcome in particular states. Because what we've seen is, and this is alluded to by several of us during this, the decentralization of our system is often leveraged by the losers of elections to breed doubt about elections. They want to say, oh, well, Ohio, where I won, has great election policies, but Georgia, where I lost, has all of these problems with how they run elections. Even though if you look at Ohio and Georgia, the availability of early voting and mail voting is pretty much the same. They might vary a little bit in terms of dates and times, but they both allow it pretty easily. And the really only difference there is the outcome. And I'm wondering whether, and I'm just thinking out loud here, you probably would see differences in how voters in those states would respond in September and how voters would respond in December based solely upon outcomes if they differ.
We got another question in from Jonathan Diaz. A lot of the public concern about mail voting seems to be focused on how long states take to process it, not the actual laws around how they're returned or the rules around returning them. Can you discuss what sorts of policies on the administration side of things states should consider to make the processing of early ballots easier on election officials and hopefully increase voters' trust in the system?
Yeah, we put out a piece on this recently. There's a couple of there's several variables. One of the biggest variables you can't do anything about, and that's the margin of victory. Because election officials aren't actually telling you who won a race on election night. They've never done that. They can't tell you that. They take days or usually weeks to count, recount if necessary, audit, and then certify results. There are states that have had primaries this month that we think we know the outcome of officially, and they're not official yet because they haven't been certified. And the margin is usually what drives that. The media can call a race that's a very wide margin. We'll know, we will think we know who won California's presidential race at 8 p.m. Pacific time on November 5th. California will have 99% of its ballots still to count at that point in time, but the margins are very big. So that's the first one. The second one is how many mail ballots there are and how many of them were returned at the latest moment. No matter what the laws are, an election official can't verify a mail ballot and start counting it until they've got it. So if they get delivered on election day or late on election day, it's going to take some time. And that's also the busiest time for election officials. They got other things going on. They're finishing up polling at the polling places and things along those lines and reporting results that have come in. And then the last variable, and this is an area where we've made some progress, is whether election officials around the country have the ability to start processing a mail ballot, start verifying the identity of who sent it in, making sure it's a valid vote cast when they receive that ballot. So for all of the very diligent voters who are delivering ballots earlier, getting them to election officials well before election day, in most of the states, those election officials are able to start processing it. Arizona is a good example. Arizona had, even though the vast majority of their votes were by mail, they had within about 24 hours counted around 95% plus of all the ballots in this week's primary there, which is really remarkable. And those remaining ballots were almost all what they like to call late earlies. They're the ballots that were delivered late on election day and they couldn't get to until they had finished up with everything else. There were 3 states in 2020 that had real challenges with regard to processing mail ballots, particularly with a hugely inflated volume due to COVID. And those states were Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, all of whom did not allow the beginning of processing of mail ballots until, in the case of Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, election day itself. Michigan allowed it 1 day before. The good news is this year that's changed in Michigan. Michigan is processing them many, many days before. They're going to be well out in front of them. They're going to be able to report those results. The bad news is that Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, despite being begged by election officials of both parties to allow for the pre-processing of mail ballots, they have not gotten it done yet. And I don't know if the prospects are very good. And so depending upon the volume of mail ballots, election officials are going to have to wait till election day to start that. And it could mean, especially if results are very narrow, in Wisconsin especially. Pennsylvania wasn't that close in 2020. It was about 84,000 vote margin in the presidential race, but Wisconsin was a fourth of that. And it was like that in 2016 as well. So you get a really narrow margin. It might mean we're waiting days. And, unfortunately, that's normal. That's okay. It'd be better if they allowed pre-processing, but in a state with very narrow margins, we might not know the results for days, and that's entirely normal.
Last question. Oh, go ahead,
I just want
Chris.
to say one quick thing, which is that when David's talking about processing, he's not talking about counting the ballots.
That's right.
He's talking about opening, looking and making sure that the voter has returned it, signed it, all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. And then they go in a stack, but those stacks can be counted within sometimes minutes or hours, depending on how many they are through the electronic counting machines. I just want to jump in with one other piece on that, which is we're having a debate at this point in the country about hand counting of ballots, even those counted on election day. And this problem could come up with those election day ballots again, causing delays because hand counting is much slower, much less accurate, and much more likely to lead to recounts. And so there's a very good reason that we've moved away in our technology from hand counting. But that's a piece that's not related to voting before election day, but is related to when are we going to know that it's important to sort of keep front and center as well.
That's exactly right.
And then lastly, quickly, guys, I just was curious. You touched on this a little bit, David, but what are you expecting in terms of 2024 early vote total? Like what percentage of the electorate are you both kind of, I want to put you on the spot. It's kind of like a little like March Madness pool. What number are you expecting early this election cycle?
As long as you don't hold it to me, because I'm always wrong about these things. I think 50% is my over-under on this. On the one hand, there's going to be a lot of interest in this election and a lot of people vote, but a lot of, as I mentioned, the people who vote in midterms are much more regular voters. They're once every 2-year voters. About a third of all the voters we're going to see in November are once every 4-year voters or never having voted before. And they might not have as much information about these options available to them. But we have seen that the trend line's been pretty steady, Chris. I mean, I don't know. I tend to think we're probably going to be in the 50 to 55% of votes cast either by mail or early in person.
Yeah, I'll give a shout out to Miles's coverage. There's a graph there, and you can draw the line across the years of the rise in voting before election day, and right, it points right at 50% for this presidential election. Could it be a little more? Yes, if the parties mobilize. Could it be a little less? Yes, if the former president attacks it and drives it down among partisans. But it's going to be right around that 50% mark.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Miles. Thanks to everyone who joined. Liz, you ready to get in here?
Yes. Thank you, speakers. Thank you, everybody, for coming on the conversation today. You can see a QR code that I think Walker's going to put up on the screen. If you haven't read the report yet, you can do that on the CEIR website. Go deep into the data. Just so you know, David also launched a new series of short videos on YouTube, so please check those out and subscribe. And you can follow Miles's work on X at Miles Parks, or you can subscribe to the NPR Politics podcast to hear his work. Thanks again for joining us. We'll be having more webinars, so please stay tuned and we'll see you next time. Have a great weekend.